For over 3,000 years, one name has echoed through the corridors of history, transcending religion, art, and warfare. A name that represents the ultimate underdog, the poetic warrior, and the flawed heart of a nation. But before the golden crown and the limestone palaces of Jerusalem, there was only the smell of dust, the bleating of sheep, and the silence of the Judean wilderness. To understand the man who would become the greatest king of Israel, we must first look at a nation in crisis. The year is approximately 1020 BC. The first king of Israel, Saul, a man of towering stature and military prowess, has begun to unravel. His heart, once aligned with the divine, has become a fortress of paranoia and disobedience. In the celestial courts, the decree has already been passed. The spirit of leadership has departed from Saul, leaving a vacuum that only a man after God's own heart can fill. Deep in the outskirts of Bethlehem, a small, unremarkable village, lived a man named Jesse. When the prophet Samuel, the most powerful spiritual figure of the era, arrived in Bethlehem, the elders of the city trembled. Samuel was there on a secret, treasonous mission to anoint a new king while Saul still sat on the throne. Jesse presented his sons, one by one. First came Eliab, tall, handsome, and regal. Samuel looked at him and thought, "Surely this is the one." But the response he received is one that defines the entire biblical narrative. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. 7 brothers passed before the prophet, and 7 times the answer was no. "Are these all the sons you have?" Samuel asked. Jesse's reply was almost an afterthought. "There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep." In the cultural hierarchy of the ancient Near East, the youngest son was often the least significant. Assigned the lonely and dangerous task of shepherding, they sent for him. As the young boy approached, the dust of the fields still on his skin, the Bible describes him as ruddy, with a fine appearance and handsome features. This was David, the name itself, Dawid, likely meaning beloved. As he stood before his brothers, the prophet took the horn of oil and poured it over his head. In that moment, the trajectory of human history shifted. The oil symbolized a weight of responsibility that the young boy could not yet comprehend. He was now a king in waiting, a secret monarch in a land ruled by a dying dynasty. But the anointing didn't lead to a palace. It led back to the pastures. This is the first great detail of David's life. His preparation was in isolation. To the world, he was a simple shepherd, but the wilderness was his military academy. To protect his flock, David didn't have a phalanx of soldiers. He had a sling and a staff. When a lion or a bear attacked, he didn't run. He fought. The Hebrew text suggests a level of ferocity rarely attributed to a youth. He would grab the predator by its fur and strike it down. This period developed in him a unique psychological profile, a blend of absolute self, reliance, and total dependence on the divine. He also carried a lyre, a stringed instrument. In the solitude of the hills, he composed the first of the Psalms, creating a language of intimacy with the Creator that had never been seen before. He was learning to lead a few sheep so that one day he could lead a nation. Meanwhile, in the palace of Gibeah, King Saul was being tormented by what the text calls an evil spirit, a deep, suffocating depression and spiritual unrest. His advisors suggested music therapy. By a strange twist of providence, one of Saul's servants knew of David. He described him as a brave man and a warrior who speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." David was summoned to the court. The secret king was now serving the current king, playing his lyre to soothe the man he would eventually replace. Saul loved him, not knowing he was looking at his successor. David became Saul's armor-bearer, moving between two worlds. The humble dust of Bethlehem and the high-tension atmosphere of the royal court. He was watching, learning the inner workings of a kingdom that was slowly falling apart, waiting for the moment when his private preparation would meet a public crisis. The transition from the private life of a shepherd to the public stage of a national hero happened in a valley called Elah. This was not just a battlefield, it was a theater of psychological warfare. The Philistines, a sophisticated sea-faring people with superior iron technology, had moved deep into Judah's territory for 40 days, a symbolic number in the Bible representing testing. The two armies stood on opposing ridges, separated by a narrow ravine. Every morning and every evening, a champion emerged from the Philistine line, Goliath of Gath. He was a monstrosity of a man standing nearly 9 feet tall, encased in bronze armor that weighed over 125 pounds. His spearhead alone weighed 15 pounds. His challenge was simple: choose a man and have him come down to me. In ancient warfare, this was called representative combat, a way to settle a war without a full-scale massacre. Saul and all the men of Israel were dismayed and terrified. The king, who was supposed to be the tallest man in Israel, sat paralyzed in his tent. Enter David. He wasn't there to fight. He was a delivery boy, bringing roasted grain and bread to his older brothers. When he heard Goliath's mockery, he didn't feel fear. He felt righteous indignation. He asked a question that shifted the perspective from the physical to the spiritual. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? To David, Goliath wasn't a giant. He was just another predator, like the lion or the bear, standing between God and his flock. When David was finally brought before Saul, the king tried to dress the boy in royal armor. It was a clash of paradigms. Saul's trust was in bronze and iron. David's trust was in the unseen. David discarded the heavy helmet and coat of mail, famously stating, "I cannot go in these, because I am not used to them." Instead, he went to the wadi, the dry stream bed, and selected 5 smooth stones. Why 5? Some historians suggest Goliath had 4 brothers, and David was prepared for them all, armed only with his shepherd's staff and his sling, a weapon that in the hands of a skilled slinger could hurl a stone at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. He stepped into the valley. The confrontation was brief. Goliath laughed, insulted by the sight of a boy with a stick. David's response is one of the most powerful declarations in the biblical text. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." As Goliath moved in for the kill, David didn't retreat. He ran toward the battle line. He reached into his bag, slung a stone, and it sank deep into the giant's forehead, the only vulnerable spot in his armor. The giant fell face first. David, having no sword of his own, drew Goliath's massive blade and finished the task. In a single moment, the shepherd boy became a legend. But fame is a double-edged sword. As the army returned home, the women of Israel came out dancing and singing. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. This song planted a seed of murderous jealousy in Saul's heart. From that day on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. David was promoted to a commander in the army and in every mission. He was more successful than the last. He became the best friend of Saul's son, Jonathan, and eventually the husband of Saul's daughter, Michal. He was now a member of the royal family, but he was living in a house of mirrors. Saul's paranoia eventually turned into overt violence. While David played the lyre to soothe the king, Saul hurled a spear at his head. David escaped, but he was no longer a hero of the court. He was a fugitive. He had to flee into the very wilderness where he had once tended sheep. This marks the beginning of the Cave of Adullam period. David was joined by all those who were in distress or in debt or discontented, about 400 men. He became a leader of outcasts, a Robin Hood figure in the caves of En-Gedi and the deserts of Ziph. For years he lived on the run, pursued by a king who had lost his mind and his mandate. Twice, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, once in a cave and once in a camp. But both times he refused to stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed. This demonstrated David's core character. He refused to take by force what God had promised to give in his own time. The turning point of the narrative arrives not with a crown, but with a funeral. News reached David in Ziklag that Saul and his sons, including David's soul-bound friend Jonathan, had fallen on the slopes of Mount Gilboa during a crushing defeat by the Philistines. At this moment, David could have celebrated. His persecutor was dead. Instead, he tore his clothes and wept, composing the Song of the Bow, a lament so profound it was ordered to be taught to the entire nation. It was the mark of a true king, one who loved his country more than his own vindication. David moved to Hebron, where the men of Judah anointed him king over their house. For 7.5 years, a civil war simmered between the house of Saul and the house of David. But as the biblical text notes, David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Finally, at age 30, the elders of all 12 tribes came to Hebron. They acknowledged what had been true since the fields of Bethlehem. The Lord said to you, "You shall shepherd my people Israel." They made a covenant, and for the first time, a shepherd held the scepter of a united nation. But a united nation needed a neutral capital, a city that belonged to no single tribe. David turned his eyes toward a rocky fortress held by the Jebusites, a city called Jerusalem. The Jebusites mocked him from their high walls, claiming even the blind and the lame could defend such a stronghold. But David's men discovered a secret, a vertical water shaft leading into the heart of the city. In a daring tactical strike, the impenetrable fortress fell. David took up residence in the stronghold, and the City of David was born. With a capital established and a palace of cedar built by the king of Tyre, David sought to center the nation not on himself, but on the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant, the golden chest representing the divine throne, had been neglected in a private house for decades. David's first attempt to bring it to Jerusalem ended in tragedy when a man named Uzzah touched the ark to steady it and died. This was a sobering lesson for the king. God's presence cannot be managed or handled with casual familiarity. It must be approached with holiness. Months later, David tried again, this time following the specific instructions of the law. As the ark entered the gates of Jerusalem, the king of Israel stripped off his royal robes and danced with all his might before the Lord, wearing only a simple linen ephod. It was an act of radical humility that scandalized his wife Michal, but it signaled a new era. Israel was now a liturgical kingdom, a nation defined by its worship. At the height of his power, David sat in his cedar palace and felt a pang of guilt. Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent. He wanted to build a permanent temple. But through the prophet Nathan, God flipped the script. God promised that instead of David building a house for him, God would build a house for David. This is the Davidic covenant, the theological spine of the entire Bible. God promised that David's throne would be established forever. This was the promise of a Messiah, a son of David, who would reign over an eternal kingdom. This covenant transformed David from a local king into a cosmic figure, the forefather of the Christ. Under David's leadership, Israel's borders expanded to their greatest historical extent. He defeated the Philistines so thoroughly they never again posed an existential threat. He subdued the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Arameans. He turned a collection of fractured, frightened tribes into a regional superpower. He established a sophisticated administration, a standing army, and a national choir of 4,000 musicians. It was the Golden Age. The shepherd had successfully turned his staff into a scepter, and for a moment, it seemed as though the Garden of Eden had been restored in the hills of Judea. Peace was on the horizon, and the king was at the zenith of his glory. But as history has often shown, the greatest danger to a hero is not the giant on the battlefield, but the silence of a palace balcony. The peak of a mountain is often a precipice. In the ancient world, kings were expected to lead their armies into battle at the turn of the year, but the Bible records a chilling deviation. But David remained in Jerusalem. In this moment of idle comfort, the king walked onto the roof of his palace and saw a woman named Bathsheba bathing. The sequence that follows is a masterclass in the anatomy of a fall he saw. He inquired. He took. Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men, a soldier of supreme loyalty currently fighting on the front lines. When David discovered she was pregnant, he attempted a cover-up that spiraled into cold-blooded murder. He ordered Uriah to the front of the heaviest fighting and commanded the troops to withdraw, leaving him to die. The shepherd had become a wolf. For a year, David lived in the silence of his guilt. But the silence was broken by the prophet Nathan. Nathan told a story of a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb to feed a guest. David, the former shepherd, was outraged, shouting, "The man who did this must die!" Nathan's response remains one of the most electric moments in literature. "You are the man!" The mask fell. David did not offer excuses. He offered a broken heart. He penned Psalm 51, a desperate cry for a clean heart. God forgave him, but the sword would never depart from his house. The child born of the affair died, and the internal rot of David's family began to mirror the rot of his sin. The consequences manifested in his children. His eldest son, Amnon, committed a horrific crime against his half-sister Tamar. David, perhaps paralyzed by his own past failures, did nothing. This inaction fueled the rage of Tamar's brother, Absalom. Absalom murdered Amnon and eventually launched a full-scale coup against his father. David, once the conqueror of Jerusalem, was forced to flee his own city in tears, barefoot and head covered, as his own son hunted him. The kingdom was split by a bloody civil war. In the final battle in the forest of Ephraim, David's generals ignored his plea to deal gently with the young man Absalom. Absalom was caught by his hair in the branches of an oak tree and executed. When the news reached David, his cry echoed through the gates. "Oh, my son Absalom! My son Absalom! If only I had died instead of you!" David returned to the throne, but he was a changed man, chastened, wary, and deeply aware of the cost of grace. In his final years, he focused on preparing for the future, though he was not allowed to build the temple because he was a man of war. He spent his remaining strength gathering the resources, gold, silver, and cedar, so that his son Solomon could succeed where he could not. In his final days, as he lay cold and frail, he secured Solomon's succession against another brewing coup, ensuring the line of the covenant remained intact. His final words to Solomon were a call back to the very beginning. "Be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires." David died at the age of 70, having reigned for 40 years. He was buried in the city of David, the fortress he had won. He was a man of staggering contradictions, a giant killer who was conquered by his own lust, a king who lived as a fugitive, a saint who was also a sinner. Yet, he is the only person in the Bible called a man after God's own heart. Why? Not because he was perfect, but because he was honest. He never hid from God, even in his darkest moments. The shepherd's song didn't end in the grave. It became the foundation for a hope that would culminate 1,000 years later in the streets of Bethlehem, when another son of David would be born to establish a kingdom that would truly never end.